The following is an essay to explain why cultural Marxism took off the way it did. I have tried to keep this as brief as possible. Thanks for watching.
The Silent Victory: How Communist Ideology Subverted the West Through Its Own Institutions. Introduction. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 was widely celebrated as the ultimate victory of Western liberal democracy over communist totalitarianism. The West, particularly the United States, viewed the dissolution of the USSR as the end of Marxist ideology, believing that with the collapse of its state apparatus, communism had effectively been defeated. Yet in the decades since, Marxist-derived ideologies have flourished in Western institutions under various rebranded forms affecting politics, culture, and education in ways that would have seemed unimaginable during the Cold War. This essay explores how this ideological transformation occurred, not through direct conspiracy or deliberate long-term planning, but rather as an accidental yet highly effective consequence of game theory, the self-replicating nature of intellectual movements, and the naive assumptions of Western elites. It posits that while the fallen communist states may never have known how successful their ideological retreat would be, the system they left behind in Western academia and culture became self-sustaining, ultimately working against the very civilization that thought it had defeated them. Game theory and the miscalculation of the West during the Cold War, the U.S. government increasingly relied on game theory to model international relations and predict the behavior of both allies and enemies. This theoretical framework assumed that all actors, including states and individuals, acted out of rational self-interest, always seeking to maximize their own benefits. The American strategy for dealing with communist states, whether through containment, deterrence, or economic pressure, was based on the belief that once communism failed, its adherents would abandon it in favor of the Western model. What game theory failed to predict was that ideas operate differently from state actors. When the USSR and other communist regimes collapsed, the assumption was that Marxism, which had been so central to their ideological framework, would disappear along with them. However, the West underestimated the extent to which Marxist-derived thought had already penetrated its own institutions, particularly in universities, media, and cultural movements. The intellectual infiltration of the West. By the time the Cold War ended, Marxist and neo-Marxist thinkers had already embedded themselves deeply within Western academia. Figures such as Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Marcuse, Horkheimer, and later postmodernists like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida had reshaped Marxist theory to make it more palatable to Western intellectuals. They distanced themselves from the overt economic determinism of classical Marxism and instead reframed it around power structures, cultural hegemony, and identity politics. Gramsci's cultural hegemony argued that the ruling class maintains control not just through economic dominance, but through ideological supremacy, meaning that Marxist revolution had to begin within education, media, and culture. The Frankfurt School's critical theory sought to deconstruct Western civilization from within, attacking traditional values, morality, and even reason itself as tools of oppression. Foucault and Derrida introduced postmodernism, which rejected absolute truth and promoted the idea that all knowledge is constructed through power dynamics, thus allowing Marxist critiques to be endlessly repackaged under new guises such as feminism, post-colonialism, and critical race theory. These intellectual movements gained traction in the universities of the West, which were not seen as threats by policymakers focused on geopolitical conflict. This miscalculation proved disastrous, as by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, these ideas had already become self-sustaining. The self-replication of Marxist thought. Unlike traditional warfare, ideological warfare does not require a central command once an idea has successfully embedded itself into a system. The collapse of state-sponsored communism did not mean the collapse of Marxist ideology. Instead, it created an opportunity for these ideas to spread without the baggage of Soviet authoritarianism. The West, believing itself victorious, let its guard down just as these ideological forces were gaining momentum. How did this happen? Marxism was rebranded, not abandoned. Without the stigma of the Soviet Union, Marxist ideas were repackaged into academic disciplines that sounded benign: ethnic studies, gender studies, post-colonial studies, etc. These disciplines retained the oppressor-oppressed framework, but applied it to race, gender, and sexuality instead of class. Universities became the ideological factories. Western academia, believing itself to be a space of free inquiry, did not see the creeping influence of ideological indoctrination. Professors trained in critical theory went on to educate generations of students who then entered media, government, and corporations. Over time, a self-reinforcing system emerged where those who rejected these ideas were systematically pushed out of academic and professional spaces. The West's own elites found Marxist thought useful. Many politicians and corporate leaders discovered that these ideas provided a perfect tool for consolidating power under the guise of progress. The division of society along racial, gender, and class lines allowed for greater control, as populations in conflict with each other are easier to manage. A silent victory that no one expected. If the former communist states had been actively coordinating a long-term plan to subvert the West, they could hardly have designed a more effective strategy than what happened naturally. The irony is that Western institutions did all the work for them. Western academics adopted Marxist theory not as a Soviet import, but as their own intellectual achievement. Western media amplified these ideas, framing them as moral imperatives. Corporations, sensing power in aligning with these trends, enforced them as new cultural norms. Governments, unable to recognize the ideological shift, embraced these ideas under the assumption that they were part of social progress. Conclusion: the West's intellectual arrogance. The West did not fall to communism through military defeat or political conquest. It succumbed to the slow, patient spread of ideological subversion that it failed to take seriously. The victory of the fallen communist states was unintentional, a consequence of game theory's miscalculations, the self-replicating nature of ideological movements, and the naive belief that winning a Cold War meant winning an intellectual war. As a result, the Western world finds itself in a paradoxical situation. Having supposedly defeated Marxism, it is now ruled by its derivatives. The institutions that once championed free thought now enforce ideological conformity. The societies that prided themselves on individual liberty now promote collectivist identity politics. And the governments that celebrated the end of authoritarian socialism now wield its rhetoric in the pursuit of equity and social justice. The final irony is this: the West's greatest enemy was never a foreign power, but its own intellectual class, one that, in its arrogance, unwittingly became the very force of subversion it thought it had defeated. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more. I would like to address something right here. I believe that it is possible to win back the ground that has been lost. It will take hard work, but that is what we do as Americans. What this information does is give us a direction for how to correct this. But that is a different episode. Again, thanks for watching.